right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. October. We love October here because this is the month where we dedicate a lot of our airtime to space exploration. So, of course, we host astronauts, but we also host a lot of scientists and engineers who make so many of these missions possible behind the scenes. And not only that, but really push the limits of our exploration out into our solar system, into the universe, and of course, turning a lens back on our planet so we can learn more about our home. So it's been a great month so far. If you want to check out some of the events that are coming up, you can head to exploringbytheseat.com. You can find all of our space events coming up to register, but there's also a handful of events from the worlds of science, exploration, conservation, and adventure. So do take some time after today's event and check out what we have coming up. We have an awesome event in store for you today. We're going to spend a little time with Richard Garriott. So on October 12th, 2008, he flew to the International Space Station as a space tourist, the sixth private astronaut to live aboard the International Space Station before returning 12 days later. Now, Richard's no stranger to exploration. As an avid explorer, he's traveled the globe from the jungles of the Amazon to the South Pole to the depths of the Titanic. And most recently, he visited Challenger Deep, the deepest point in our ocean. He's currently serving as the president of the Explorers Club and is the first explorer to have explored pole to pole, orbited the Earth, and reached the deepest point of our ocean. So I'm going to bring Richard in live with us right now. Hey, Richard, how you doing today?
Excellent, Joe. Great to be with you and all the students today.
Excellent. Well, it's great to have you live from your office at the Explorers Club in New York. Very cool place to visit if you are ever in the area. But we have a great crew with us today, Richard, from across Canada, from across the United States. We've got camera classes, groups tuning in via YouTube. We're excited to dive into your story for a bit.
Fantastic. I got to see some of the connections being made with those students as they were coming online. So I got to see a few of their smiling faces as they were logging in. And it's obviously a great pleasure and privilege to be with not just you, but all those kids here today. So I'm ready to jump in whenever you would like.
All right. I'm hiding backstage for a bit. We're going to let you take
hang
over.
on. Let me bring up my slides. There we go. Tell me if that looks all good to you there, Joe.
Looks good. We're ready.
All right. Well, hello again, everybody. As Joe mentioned, my name is Richard Garriott de Cayeux. I happen to be currently president of the Explorers Club, which is the office you see here behind me. And I'm the second generation astronaut. But even more than that, of course, as Joe mentioned, I happen to be the only explorer who's been from the North Pole to the South Pole, orbit above the Earth in space aboard the International Space Station, and dove more recently down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. And I'm going to focus a bit, most of my time today on space, but I'm going to mention a few slides at the end about going deep also, since it was just a year ago that I did that. But as I'm sure most of you would understand, getting to fly into space, becoming an astronaut is hard. And it used to be, when I was young, the only way to do that, of course, was with NASA. I worked hard to get there, but I also happen to be pretty darn lucky. But I'm a big believer that luck is something that happens when you are well prepared and opportunities show up in front of you. And in my case, I was very lucky when I was in high school, when this type of computer called a teletype came out. I was really fascinated by it, even when none of the teachers or other students really understood it. And it's interesting that my parents, my mother was an artist and a naturalist, and my father was an astronaut. And that combination of high-tech art sort of makes it pretty natural that my first career would be computer games, because I think that's sort of the quintessential high-tech art. And going from the games that I made on that teletype, I still make them actually. So it's been almost 45 years I've been making video games. One of the very first ever creators of video games. The word avatar comes from my games. Massively multiplayer online games come from my games. And so obviously that's been a big part of my being, and also what helped sponsor a lot of the exploration that I've been doing. And so, I grew up kind of believing that everybody goes to space. Not only was my dad an astronaut, but all my neighbors were astronauts. We lived right outside of the front gates of NASA. But a NASA doctor, when I was just a little older than most of you, was giving me an eye test, saw that was telling me I'm going to need glasses, and said, "Hey, I hate to break it to you, but you are no longer eligible to be a NASA astronaut." And I was stunned and upset. And after getting over that, I said, well, then I'm just going to have to build another way to get to space. I'm going to have to build my own space agency. And ultimately, that's really what happened and what I did. And for 10 years, I was trying to help build commercial. The first 10 years of trying to help build commercial space didn't work out very well, but I came close once. We actually put a module in the back of the shuttle payload bay called Space Hab, and we were planning to put passengers in it. And we did fly the Space Hab, but NASA ultimately wouldn't let us put private citizens in it. So close, but no cigar, so to speak. Then I built once. In fact, I was actually, after I joined the Explorers Club, I started building a sequence of other companies that eventually helped unlock commercial human spaceflight. The X Prize, which paid a $10 million prize for the first vehicle to go into space. Zero G Corp, that flies parabolic flights on an airplane. And the company that actually chartered the first 7 flights into space, called Space Adventures, that also is what I chartered my flight through. But what's interesting is, even after I built a company that chartered the Russian Soyuz to take people to space, it still was hard, because first of all, it was really expensive. And after I sold my first company, I had the money, I was planning to go, but then in the year 2000, the stock market crashed, and I had to sell the first private seat to go to space to another person by the name of Dennis Tito, who became the first private citizen to fly into space. So I built another game company. I sold another game company, but right as I was about to go again in 2008, in fact, I did go in 2008, but there was another stock market crash. And so actually I was losing all my money again, right as I was hoping to go into space. In addition to that money, I actually had a medical problem. They found that I had I had a malformation, a birth defect on one lobe of my liver. So I was missing the vein to drain that lobe of my liver, and they actually made me remove it. So that's a scar now that I have on my belly that's sort of a memento of training to go to space. And even after I had that surgery, I then had to prove that I would survive a 9G centrifuge run without it rupturing. So it was a very difficult part of the training. And even then, after all of that, even 3 days prior to my takeoff, my launch into space, NASA again came back to me and tried to ban me from going into the US segments of the International Space Station, largely due to geopolitics that are kind of related to what's going on right now with Russia and some of its old neighbors. But it happened in 2008 as well with a country called Georgia. And so it almost, again, prevented me from going. But finally, after all these trials and tribulations, on October 12th of 2008, I became the 483rd person to orbit the Earth and the first second-generation astronaut in that launch that you see there on a Soyuz TMA-13. And this is just a list of some of the experiments I did. I mean, so even though I flew privately, I actually prefer to just be called a private astronaut than, say, a, quote, space tourist, because I don't think what I did was tourism. I actually had a full load of work to do while I was up there. One of the most interesting ones was growing these little crystals that you see here. These are crystals of proteins, which don't crystallize very well on Earth due to gravity. But up in space, without gravity, these crystals can grow much more purely, much more successfully. And when you grow those crystals, it lets you use a sophisticated technology called X-ray diffraction to find these images, to create these images of the precise molecular structure of those proteins, which is very important for companies trying to develop medicines. But now we're in a new golden age of human spaceflight. The vehicles that, frankly, I'd like to believe that some of my companies and friends helped bring into existence are creating like these new rockets. I'm sure you've seen SpaceX's vehicles that can now land themselves. That's this reusability is dropping the price by 100-fold already, and maybe 1,000-fold compared to back in the shuttle era. It's becoming profitable to do work in space now, as it's always been good science, but now you can actually do applications that more than pay for themselves. And it turns out, as of this year, like me being a private astronaut, the majority of all astronauts last year, this year, and forever into the future are not going to be government astronauts. The majority are going to be private astronauts. And And so that's bringing up a bunch of other amazing things in space. One is commercial space stations that are being built right now. Very soon we're going to have bases on the moon doing things like mining some of the water out of the poles to make propellant for even further and deeper space exploration. I happen to be a big proponent of something called asteroid mining, where pretty soon we're going to go to near asteroids, because asteroids are full of all kinds of things that are valuable right here on Earth. Like, for example, metal that we spend a lot of money stripping the surface of the Earth to get a very small amount of metals, but it looks like we can get a lot more of that back from space. And ultimately, of course, we're going to start moving out into space. Jeff Bezos of Blue Origin and Amazon fame is excited to build space colonies, often referred to as O'Neill colonies, from the guy who originally proposed this type of settlement in space. And of course, Elon Musk with SpaceX, he is working hard to let humans colonize Mars. I happen to be an investor in SpaceX, and so I'm hoping I get to go do exactly this sometime in the next 10 or 20 years. And in fact, I literally expect to live on Mars within my lifetime. And I think it's going to actually be pretty easy for you compared to how hard it was for my generation and for my father's generation. But it's worth noting that if you decide you want to go into space, here's a friend of mine, Clayton Anderson, who wrote this book called The Ordinary Spaceman. And he notes in the book that he actually had to apply to get the job 14 different times in a row. That's 14 years in a row he reapplied for that job. And most astronauts I know, that same thing. Just like I told you, it was really hard for me. It took me 20 or 30 years to pull it off. Took Clayton 15 years to pull it off, at least. I don't know what the frequency of his applications were, but no faster than once per year. But I want to take just a couple slides to also talk about the Challenger Deep, going down to the bottom of the deepest place on the Earth. And what's interesting about a submarine is it's a lot like a spacecraft. The life support inside a submarine is still scrubbing out the carbon dioxide, adding oxygen. In the case of a spacecraft, you hold in the air pressure. In the case of a submarine, you hold out the water pressure. But otherwise, they're very similar kinds of operations. And I wrote it a year ago, plus back in March, about 18 months ago. I went down to the deepest point on Earth at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. And we went out on this research vessel called Pressure Drop. We launched the limiting factor off the side of that ship, off the stern of the ship. We then descended to the bottom for about 4 hours. When you finally reach the bottom, we would explore the rugged terrain at the very bottom of the deepest point in the ocean. Sadly, there's lots of trash down there. In addition, like right when we got to the bottom, we saw this. It's a little bit hard to see. Maybe you can see the loops where those red arrows are pointing, but that's actually scientific trash. There was actually fiber optic cable dropped on the bottom of the seafloor that we ran into right as we got to the bottom. But there's also an amazing amount of important science that can be done down there. There's lots of life forms living down there. We could put out bait to attract various kinds of creatures. Then we'd take 4 hours to get back up to the surface. And then we had laboratories on board where we could look at some of the mud and animals that we brought up from the bottom, including, unfortunately, how much plastic there was living inside of so many of the creatures we'd pull up from the bottom of the ocean. But it will then take us, there's so much data to analyze. They were literally still a year and a half later studying a lot of the data we brought back from that trip. But if I had one message that I was going to say was most important to leave you with, which is this is a chart of something out of Japan they call ikigai, which is if you find something you love to do that you happen to also be good at, that the world sort of needs, and they're willing to pay you for, boy, you have found a great career. And I feel really lucky that in my life I actually found sort of that cluster of things. And I'm still not sure exactly what I'm going to do when I grow up. But I've been very fortunate to be able to follow the things that I really enjoyed, and they happen to be things that were important and ultimately made money also. And so keep trading, seek those opportunities, create that luck by the proper intersection between preparation and opportunity. I know if I can do it, I know you can do it. And so I'll be curious to see when you all have gone out exploring and you come back with Joe, hear the stories that you guys have to tell. So With that, I'll stop here, and maybe Joe will flip over to let kids ask some questions if they'd like.
All right, perfect. Well, Richard, thank you so much for that great presentation. I absolutely love your story because, I think, well, a lot of reasons. One, I think if you can find something you're passionate about and turn it into a career, there's nothing better than being able to do that every day. And, a lot of people talk themselves out of it and that it's going to be hard or maybe some obstacles come up. But I think your story is a really good one of not letting those obstacles stand in your way. And though, there were bumps in the road, you learn from them and you push through and look what happened. You made it.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting about the video games and exploration, which to me are very related, they're creating virtual environments or exploring real environments. They're in my mind related. But at first, I was earning money with making games and only losing money or spending money or investing money in exploration. I was enjoying it, but by no means would it have been a career. However, now that we've helped open up the commercial space industry, that of course is a big deal from a financial perspective too. And so it's taken a lot longer, but now that is a place that I earn money also. And so, in fact, it's sort of replaced games. I'm still involved in games for fun because I like it. But now it's the space business that has really become the place that I earn money now. And so thinking that through of going like, make sure you're doing a job that can pay you while you also fund the things that are also that you enjoy, that you might like to turn into a career, that might stay a hobby. It's like my daughter is really enjoying singing at school, and we're going like that could be a career. It's possible, but almost any career you start, you also want to make sure you have this diverse enough skill sets to support your hobbies while you determine if they can become a career.
All right. Well, we're going to turn things over to Q&A very shortly. But before we do, I pulled together a little Kahoot quiz behind the scenes. We'll get our students interacting and see how well they were tuned in today. So if you head to kahoot.it, you will find it's going to ask you for a PIN number. And I'm going to share that on the screen very shortly. So kahoot.it, let me share my screen now, and we will get that up there. Here we go. So our PIN number for today is 4913786. If you have one-to-one tech in your classroom, that's great. You can use it right at your seat. If not, no big deal. Your teacher could pop it up on the front board and you can shout out your answers. Lots of ways that you can join. If you have a tablet or a smartphone, just scan that QR code and it'll bring you right in. And I can see classrooms and or students already starting to join. So you're going to get that preloaded name. They're all animal names. We've got the Focused Yeti and the Magic Koala in already. So we'll give a few moments to get some of the students and some of the full classrooms in. And it's going to be 4 questions. There'll be a little multiple choice, a little true and false, 20 seconds for each question. The quicker you get your answer in, the more points you're going to get. I should add too, it needs to be the right answer, because if you put the wrong one in super fast, that's not going to do anything for you. So you can see we've got some students loading in now. We'll give another few moments while we start thinking about questions as well. The classrooms who are joining us via YouTube, I can see lots have said hi already. There's Connecticut. I see St. Thomas, Cambridge, Peterborough here in Ontario. So keep introducing yourselves, and then you can start putting your questions into that chat. And we will take those questions when the time comes. So we've got almost 60 students / groups in. We'll give it another maybe 10 seconds, and then we'll take things live. Okay, here we go. All right, first question coming up. How many days did Richard spend on board the International Space Station? Was it 3, 6, 12, or 20? We've got answers coming in. We've got 10 seconds left on the clock. right. Good job, crew. The majority went with 12 days. And Richard, I imagine it just flew by.
Yeah, in fact, it went by so fast. And one thing I didn't get a chance to talk about is when you're in orbit around the Earth, you see a sunrise or a sunset every 45 minutes because you're going around the Earth every 90 minutes. And so your day and night are sort of all blurred together. And going to sleep is frankly hard because you're pretty excited to be there and there's so much to see and do. So yeah, it was definitely a blur. But even the crew members that I knew were up for 6 months, I asked them, "Hey, are you ready to come home?" And they were going like, "Well, I have a wife and kids at home, so I think I ought to come home. But if it wasn't for that, I'd stay here even after 6 months."
Oh man, that's absolutely amazing. Okay, our leaderboard, the Focused Yeti, is in first spot. Let's jump into our next quiz question. What are some future private space operations being developed? Was it commercial space stations, space colonies, lunar and asteroid mining, or is it all of the above? I think you just have to turn on the news pretty much any given day just to see how exciting things are getting in that private field of space exploration.
It's moving so quickly that even I have to watch the news on a daily basis to and quickly do research to find it all out.
All right. Technically everybody got the right answer because each of these individual ones are definitely being talked about, being developed, but all of the above is the correct answer there. Let's see how that shook up our leaderboard. No, the Focused Yeti holding on tight. Let's go to question 3. We got a true and false. So Richard flew to the International Space Station aboard the space shuttle. Is that true or is that false? We probably remember back to that really cool video clip that was shared of the launch of the vehicle that took Richard to the International Space Station. All right. Ooh, we definitely tricked our crew on that
Wow, we
one.
did.
Space shuttle, but it was the Russian Soyuz capsule. And Richard, to do that, did you have to learn a little bit of Russian, I imagine, during the training?
Да, сейчас я знаю русский язык. Русский язык это очень трудный. Yes, now I know a little bit of Russian, and it's very difficult. It was very difficult to learn the Russian language. And but by the way, on those spacecrafts, my father flew twice into space. He was first on an Apollo vehicle. Saturn 1B is the launch vehicle that took him up, and he did launch on the space shuttle. But my flight was on the Soyuz. We might have thrown people off because I did have a picture of that space hab that we put in the back of a shuttle that I was hoping would be my ride to space, but didn't work out.
All right. Okay, let's jump to our final question and see where we end up. The Focused Yeti looks like they might run tape to tape with this one. Even at the deepest point of the ocean, we can still find trash. Plastic pollution. Is that true or is that false? All right. Way to redeem yourself, everybody. Good job. That is true. Richard, I haven't been in a submersible, but I was on board Bob Ballard's ship, the Nautilus, on a deep sea expedition, and we were using ROVs, diving 3.5 kilometers, and we were finding everything from soda cans to paint cans to even balloons that had, blown out over the ocean, and then the plastic or the latex sank to the bottom.
Yeah, and I literally, as a pretty well-traveled explorer, I'm pretty confident there is no place I've ever been where we did not find trash. That includes the North Pole, that includes in the Antarctic, that includes every depth of the ocean I've been down to. Unfortunately, not only is our litter showing up literally scattered over the planet, but of course, when you get down to the microfibers, as that trash breaks up and breaks into smaller pieces, those microfibers are showing up in the water supplies and in the flesh of a lot of the food chain that we now eat. So it's actually a very serious and dangerous issue.
Let's take a look at our podium. How are we going to end this off here? The Expert Finch taken third. The Daring Sphinx in second. And there you go, Focused Yeti. You ran it tape to tape. All right. Good job, everybody. If you're one of those top 3 and you're in one of the classrooms, shoot us a little message. Let us know. Okay, let's switch gears here. Let's stop this screen share and let's switch over to some Q&A action because I have a feeling there is going to be loads of questions. So again, if you're tuning in live via YouTube, use that chat sidebar. But let's start off with a couple camera groups to get us rolling. We have Madame Luft's crew hanging out with us. They are in Stittsville, Ontario, a grade 6 class. So you guys are definitely studying space this year. Let's bring them in front and center. Hey, Ontario, how we doing? Excellent. Grab that mute for us and let's grab a question.
Sorry, did you? There you go.
Now I can hear you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Sorry.
Yeah, we're ready for a question. Let's grab a question.
Okay. Do you guys have a question? Someone has a question for him? Yep. Come on over. Yep. No. What was your question? Sorry. We're gonna have to pause here because we have some students who are not being very respectful. So we're gonna pause. If you can move on to somebody else, that would be great.
Absolutely.
So I can have a chat with my class.
I'll swing back your way. No worries. Okay, where should we go now? Let's go to Alabama. We've got some 5th graders hanging out with Mrs. Thrasher. So let's bring them in front and center. There we go. Hey, 5th graders, how we doing? All right, we're ready for you. Who's got a question?
All right, Christian.
Were you saying
But
that?
you can come up here.
Were you saying that you went to the Mariana Trench?
Yes, you are exactly right. I went just over a year ago. I went down in that submarine that you saw pictures of. That submarine's called Limiting Factor. It's actually the first submarine that has ever been built that can make repeated dives all the way to the deepest point on Earth. Prior to this submarine, there were only 2 times the bottom has been visited. The first time was actually before I was born. Jacques Picard and Don Walsh. Don Walsh is a member of this club. He went down there. Those 2 went down there in 1959, I think it was, or 59 or 60. Then James Cameron, the guy that filmed the movie Titanic and a bunch of other famous movies, he went down there about 20 years ago. And then this new vehicle called Limiting Factor has been going down over the last 2 years. And I was lucky enough to get a chance to go on that. So it's so yes, I've been. That's actually what made me the only person who's been pole to pole and space to deep. Was getting a chance to go down with Victor Vescovo, who is the creator of that submarine.
Was there a lot of pressure? Like, were you scared ever? Like, did you like things like cracking or pressure where you're like, I don't know.
Yeah. So what's interesting is, I mentioned during my presentation how similar submarines and spacecraft are in the sense of when you're in the vehicle, the life support and other factors are a lot of it are the same. But a spacecraft, the danger of a spacecraft is the launch, because the boosters that put you into orbit have an enormous amount of energy to be released in a very short period of time. And so the danger in a spacecraft is really launch and reentry. Once you're in space, the spacecraft only has to hold in 1 atmosphere of pressure, which is about 32 pounds per square inch. On the other hand, so that's 1 atmosphere of pressure. On the other hand, when you go to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, you have to hold out 1,000 atmospheres of pressure. The pressure is, more than, I can't remember the exact number, but something on the order of 70,000 pounds per square inch. Not only if there was a tiny defect like a hole in the vehicle, frankly, if the vehicle wasn't perfectly spherical, it is 9 centimeters thick of pure titanium. If it was not perfectly round, one side would crumple and the whole thing would be crushed instantaneously. And so either way, in space, if something goes violently wrong, it's going to go bad in a hurry. In the deep, if something goes wrong, it's going to go bad in a hurry. But in both cases, you're putting your life into the hand of mathematics and engineering. And as long as the math is done well and the engineering is done well, it usually works. And it's interesting that there has actually never been a fatality in a deep submersible. Never, on any country anywhere in the world, never been a fatality of a deep submersible. Military submersibles, of course, have had accidents and issues. And there have been fatalities in space, but most of the fatalities in space were in the earliest days of space travel. Space capsules, like the one I went in, actually are quite safe.
All right, great questions.
Thank you.
Now that the submarines have been built, how many people have traveled to the Mariana Trench?
Oh, that's a good question. It's only, first of all, still that one submarine can only take 2 people at a time. And now I was the 17th person to ever reach the bottom. And the number is something like 22 people now in the world have ever been to that depth.
All right, let's jump to another camera classroom here. We've got Mr. Barr's class hanging out with us. More grade 6s studying space this year. How we doing?
Good.
All right, we're ready for you.
Awesome. We've got McKenna asking a question first. Come on up, McKenna.
What made you go down to the deepest part of the ocean?
Well, it's interesting. I have been on a lot of deep submersible trips, but mostly to shallower targets, but still very deep. And my area of exploration that I happen to really enjoy is looking for what are called extremophile microbes, little animals that live in very unusual areas. So, for example, animals that live in the ice of Antarctica or the North Pole, animals that live at what are called hydrothermal vents, basically undersea volcanoes where hot fluids come up out of the interior of the Earth, and there's lots of life forms that live around them. And so when the opportunity came up to go to the very bottom, I was like, yes, I would love to go, because first, of course, it's a chance to go to the deepest place that exists, but also because you saw the life forms I showed in my slides. Most of those were big life forms like fish, and things that are big enough to see by eye. But there's also microbes that live down there that are too small to see by eye, that we brought back in the mud and other things we brought back, that are capable of living in these really extreme environments. And it turns out that studying animals that can survive in these extreme environments is also very good for things like medicine. I'll bet a lot of you, like I have had the COVID vaccine, and that vaccine requires that the medicine is kept at minus 80 degrees Celsius until the day they use it. And that's because the proteins fall apart fairly quickly after they warm up. And so by studying animals that can survive at different temperatures, you can find ingredients for these medicines that can survive in other different environments. And so it's actually very helpful to understand life at these extreme places.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
If you've got another one on deck, go ahead, Mr. Barr's class.
All right. I have Bryce had a question for you.
What was the most sold game that you sold?
Oh, the best-selling game. So my first #1 best-selling game was Ultima 4 Quest of the Avatar, that's where the word avatar that's in games all the time now comes from that game. And a top-selling game in that year, which was in the 1980s, that was probably sold maybe 500,000 copies. But my best-selling game of all time was one called Ultima Online, which was the first massively multiplayer of the game, where everybody in the world could play together into the same virtual world together. And that sold, in the first year, it sold maybe 3 or 4 million copies, but it still sells today. 25 years later, you can still buy that game. And so it's now had, if you add all of the 25 years of people playing that game, honestly, I don't even know how many millions. It's probably 10 to 40 million people have played the game by now. But there's actually bigger games. There's actually, I'm sure a lot of you have played a lot of the first-person shooters that are very popular these days, and some of those now have a couple 100 million players in some of the very best-selling games now.
All right, very cool. Thanks for those questions. Mr. V's crew is joining us. They're joining us from Ontario here in Canada. How are we doing today, Mr. V's crew?
We're doing good.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for having us on. We really appreciate it.
Of course.
We were wondering, how does it feel leaving and entering Earth's atmosphere?
That's mine.
Oh, that's a great question because when the spaceship lights up to push the capsule into space, the pressure builds up to push you back in the seat that you're sitting in to a very high level of effective weight that you feel. And so the best way to describe it is being on a roller coaster. Sometimes when you go over the top of a hill, you'll feel light in your seat. You'll actually get a few moments of zero gravity. And then when you go down in the bottom of a trough on a roller coaster, you kind of get pushed down in your seat. And it turns out a roller coaster gives you almost the same G forces that a rocket gives you, but in a rocket, it lasts a lot longer. And so you get 4.5 or 5 G's of pressure. And that's like 4.5 or 5 of yourself lying on your chest that you feel as you're riding that rocket into space. That's 8.5 minutes lying there with 4 or 5 of yourself lying on top of you. And so that makes it hard to breathe, hard to move, and you therefore can tell, man, we're accelerating a lot. And then when that 8.5 minutes ends, you've burned all the fuel in the entire rocket. The engine shut off, and immediately you are now floating in zero gravity. And that is the last time you felt any gravitational like force or acceleration for, in my case, 12 days. And so for 12 days, you're floating around like Superman, which is awesome, and looking back at the amazingly beautiful Earth. But then the reentry side is sort of the opposite. When you separate from the space station, you then burn the engines on the rocket to slow down just a little bit, because as soon as you're traveling less than 17,210 miles an hour, you actually start falling back into the atmosphere. And as you plunge into the Earth's atmosphere, the friction of encountering the air creates heat that is like being in a blast furnace underneath the heat shield of the capsule. And it creates heat that makes the bottom of the capsule hotter than the surface of the sun. And so it is incredibly hot. The G forces pick up again to about that same amount. But now you see the vehicle melting around you. My shoulder was right next to the window in the Soyuz, and you could see the vehicle melting all around you as you plunge into the Earth's atmosphere. So they're both launch and reentry are pretty exciting in pretty extreme ways.
That's awesome. We have one more question for you if you have the time.
Yeah, go for it.
What does life on Earth feel like after living in space?
Oh, that's a great question too, because there's a concept called the overview effect, which I had never even heard this word prior to my flight in space. But my dad, he said, Richard, the one thing you're going to remember for the rest of your life is looking out the window back at the Earth. And of course, he was quite right. When you see the Earth from orbit, it feels like there's a fire hose of information about the world we live in just pouring into your mind. And you notice like how erosion by wind and erosion by water works. And you notice how humans have built roads and built dams on rivers, and all the forests and all the deserts are covered with roads and cities, and how we're pumping up fossil water from underneath all of our deserts. And you're just captivated to look at how and learn about how all these systems work within the Earth. And then after you've been around the world a few times, kind of taking it all in, and you travel over someplace like in my case, where I grew up in Houston, I suddenly went, wow, I now know the whole scale of the Earth by direct observation. And as soon as that idea crossed my mind, suddenly it was like I felt like I was in a scary movie where an actor will be in a hallway and they'll dolly the camera backwards but zoom the lens in to where the actor stays the same size, but the hallway seems to collapse or shrink around the actor. when I was looking out the window at the Earth, of course, stayed the same size. But my sense of scale of the Earth just went really, and the Earth suddenly became small. And that stuck with me to this day. I no longer think of like traveling to the other side of the planet as like a big deal. I mean, yeah, okay, I got to sit on a plane for a while, but it's a really small planet. And so you definitely build a new relationship with the planet after you've had a chance to see it from space.
All right. And I think that's something that, if we could give everybody that experience, I think that would be a huge deal, just to understand, what we have and the finiteness of it, and, getting to see that little thin layer of atmosphere that.
You're exactly right. In fact, that atmosphere was one of the big ones where, I would see, forest fires or purposeful fires, clear cutting in the Amazon, and the smoke would go up until about the height of the clouds, maybe a little higher. Then it'd find a temperature inversion layer and spread out over entire states or countries. And so you would see that pollution. You go like, well, of course we can pollute our entire atmosphere with all the junk we put out of our cars. And of course we can use up all the fresh water. And of course we can, we are using the natural resources of the Earth very obviously, as you see it from space, to the complete limit of the Earth's natural productivity to provide it for us. And that's one of the reasons why I'm going, we have to explore space. If we don't start bringing back energy and resources like metals from space, then we're basically out here on the ground. And so we're going to have to start rationing things. Within those kids' lifetimes, there will either be significant rationing of starting with energy, but then on down, or we're going to have to start beaming energy back from space and some other things as well.
All right. We're going to wrap up with a couple questions here from YouTube. The first one is, and I think we kind of know the answer from how you described coming back, but Miss Gamble's crew would like to know about the Soyuz capsule. Is it reusable?
Oh, actually, the Soyuz capsule is not reusable. In fact, that's one of the big changes for the old days to the new days, which is, the shuttle was technically mostly reusable, but to take it apart and put it back together was almost as expensive as a new rocket. But most rockets, up until very recently, are completely disposable. The first stage drops off and crashes onto the ground. The second stage drops off and crashes to the ground. The orbital module flies around in space, and when it returns, most of it burns up, but the part that comes down hits the ground hard enough to damage all of it. And so in the case of a Soyuz, there's a piece of the control panel they reuse up to 3 times, but that's it. And that's really why it's so expensive. It was, you're not paying for the fuel. The fuel costs are like your car. Compared to buying the car, the gas isn't very expensive. The same thing's true for a rocket. And so the fact that we can now reuse our rockets, and the newest ones being built down in Texas by SpaceX are fully reusable, unlike the current ones, which are half reusable. And so that's going to bring the price down even further.
All right. Miss Mills' crew would like to know what a typical day was like in space. And then there's another question here about the food. So, yeah.
Oh, well. So, those are related questions. So, first of all, being in space is literally awesome. Floating around like Superman, looking back at the beautiful Earth, awesome. All the experiments you can do, even from just pleasure things like putting a droplet of water in front of you and letting it make a sphere that's undulating and looking through it, or drinking with a straw or with your lips, and then more serious experiments. Everything about life in space is awesome, with 2 exceptions: the food and personal hygiene. The food is almost all military rations. So they're packaged food that doesn't need to be put in a refrigerator, will stay up there for about a year before they have to throw it away. And so, we're eating this food that is kind of dried until you add water, and it's cold until you add hot water. There's no ice. There's no real stove or oven. And so, meals aren't that, just not that good. But even worse than the meals is the personal hygiene. So there's no sink, there's no bathtub, there's no shower. And so to wash yourself, you just use baby wipes to wipe it all off. You brush your teeth with a little bit of water, then you spit that water back into the bag the baby wipe came out of, hopefully with the used baby wipe in it, to absorb most of the water, but some of it splashes back on your face or inside the rocket. And then if you have to go to the bathroom, that's even worse because, gravity helps the things that come out of your body go into the toilet. And so in space where there's no gravity, they actually have a airflow system, basically a glorified vacuum cleaner that you use as a toilet. So you basically urinate or pee into a funnel that takes that away. That one actually works pretty well. But then solid waste that comes out of you has to also be pulled by airflow into little plastic bags that hopefully, work to keep solid waste away from you. But that actually doesn't work very well. And so it's actually really a hassle. So no good space toilet in my mind has ever been designed yet. And so maybe that's something you all can contribute to space, is how to make an actual functional space toilet. But otherwise, everything in space is pretty awesome.
All right. Well, not all glamorous when you're up on the ISS. All right. Well, Richard, I'm going to start off with a huge shout out to our classrooms. Thank you so much to our groups in Canada and the US with those awesome questions, playing along the Kahoot. And then, Richard, it's always great to steal a little bit of your time, whether we're talking about the ocean or leaving our planet. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Of course, Joe. I'm obviously thrilled to get a chance to talk with the kids. And anytime you want me back, you know where to find me. I'll be right here.
All right. Well, everyone, I hope to see you in more space events this month. But for today, we are going to sign off. Thanks, everyone.